Morning light reached across my kitchen like measured brushstrokes, turning unopened boxes into small city blocks around my feet. And for the first time in 15 years of saving the word, home felt like something I could touch. Then the certified envelope slid from the mail stack, heavy as a stone, and my hands went cold, the mug slipping and breaking on tile I'd picked out myself. I stood there with coffee pooling into the grout, reading my full name above a case caption that made the room tilt, Richard and Joanne Whitman v. Clara Whitman. My breath thinned as if the walls had moved closer, and I pressed my thumb against the seal of a life I'd built the slow way, week by week, shift by shift. There was a note inside citing immediate action, lined with numbers I recognized better than anyone else in this family. I set the papers on the counter and stared at the key that had opened this door only days ago. I should have felt safe here. Instead, I felt the ground give an inch under my feet. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever had to stand your ground against people you love, tap like and subscribe so this story finds others who need it. My name is Clara Whitman, and I grew up in a split level on a quiet Midwestern street where lawns were measured, hedges were even, and the story we told about ourselves was that we were good people who took care of our own. My grandfather Walter kept a coffee can of Bolts and Truth on a workbench that smelled like cedar and motor oil, and he'd say that dignity comes from doing the same small right thing over and over until it holds weight, which I tried to live by even when it wasn't fashionable in our house. My parents prized appearances, holiday cards, shot in matching sweaters, gifts wrapped in satin ribbon, the right pew at church, but the budget beneath all that polish bent in one direction. Tessa's lessons. Tessa's semesters abroad. Tessa's studios while I learned to clock in at dawn and count tips in singles, then took night classes when the city buses ran their thinnest routes. I learned the texture of frugality, early the hum of a used refrigerator that rattled through winter, the way a secondhand sofa sags in the middle but still holds, if you sit gentle, the quiet pride that comes when you cover a bill without asking anyone for help. Later, a promotion came because I kept my spreadsheets clean, and every raise went straight into a savings account. I named keys, one transfer at a time, no fanfare. When an opening on a tidy, tree-lined street finally landed within reach, 3 bedrooms, a modest yard, nothing flashy, I signed the papers with a pen I'd kept for years, for that moment, and Walter, watching on a video call, grinned like the sun itself had handed me the deed. That night, I ate takeout at the counter and pictured where a dining table might go, how the late light would fall on it in summer, whether the porch could hold a swing sturdy enough for crowded Sunday evenings, and I believed the hard part was behind me. I told my parents the next day, holding my phone out so they could see the living room. The window trim, the simple crown molding that felt like a crown I'd actually earned. Their smiles were tight, and Tessa drifted into the frame with a bag on her arm that cost more than my first car, tilting her head as if she were evaluating a gallery piece she might repaint. 3 bedrooms, my mother asked, smoothing a strand of hair, as if it were the part of this news most in need of fixing, and my father's jaw worked while he nodded, his voice warm but measured, always measured. Tessa mused aloud something about how the space could be reimagined for her concept, an airy gathering place that needed a certain kind of foundation, and she laughed lightly, like money was an idea rather than a fact. I said I'd figured the numbers carefully, that the mortgage fit my income, that I'd waited for the right interest rate, the way some people wait for a comet, and the call ended with promises to visit. I stood in the doorway afterward and listened to the neighborhood. A dog barked somewhere down the block, a screen door clicked, a bicycle chain whispered by, and for a moment I let myself believe that this street would settle my bones into a steadier rhythm than the one I was leaving behind. Walter called again that evening to ask if the locks felt sturdy and whether I'd measured the yard for a small garden. We talked about tomatoes and fence lines and a table we could build, the way maple shade moves during the afternoon, the ordinary good things that make a place yours. The envelope arrived the following morning, its weight out of proportion to its size. And I wish I could say I didn't know what it meant when I saw the return address, but there are patterns you learn to recognize even when you wish you couldn't. I wiped coffee from the counter and broke the seal because avoiding truth never made it smaller in our family. then set each page down, flat, reading once, then again hearing the refrigerator cycle on in the silence, feeling the steadiness of my own heartbeat, reminding me I was still here. The legal language wasn't theatrical. It didn't need to be. Plain lines can cut just as clean, and there in the middle of all that white space was the shape of an intention that had been forming for years without a name. I gathered the pages and placed them beside the key, and for a long minute I looked from one to the other, from the thing I'd earned to the thing someone else had set in motion. Outside, a child's laugh carried over the fence, a sound sharp and bright that reminded me the world keeps moving no matter who tries to slow you down. I took a breath and reached for my phone, and while it rang once, twice, a third time, I decided that whatever came next would have to be met in the open. The first demand wouldn't arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. It would come dressed in respectable font and careful math, insisting that love and obligation are the same line on a ledger. By the time I lifted that receiver, I could hear the shape of the argument forming, and I knew I was about to find out just how far family would take it. The phone call came that evening, just as the sun began sliding behind the neighbor's sycamore. My father's voice filled the line, measured, formal, the same tone he used when speaking to clients he wanted something from. "We need to talk about a family matter," he began. I could hear my mother's soft sniffles somewhere behind him and the faint click of a tissue box. "We've always believed in supporting one another," he said, "and your sister needs stability right now. You have space in that house more than you need. She's been working on something special, and we think that home would be the perfect environment for her to grow it." At first I thought I'd misheard him. I waited for the part where he'd laugh, where Mom would chime in and say it was a misunderstanding. Instead, my mother leaned into the conversation with a fragile-sounding voice. "Tessa's been through so much lately, Clara. It's only fair that she gets a fresh start. You can always rent an apartment for now." Her words fell into the quiet of my kitchen landing like small stones dropped into water. I took a slow breath. "This is my house," I said. "I worked for it. I planned for it." There was a sharp intake of air on the other end. "Don't be selfish," Mom snapped suddenly. "Family helps family." Then the line went dead. The next morning, a second certified envelope arrived, heavier than the first. The wording was cold, professional, and unmistakable. They were demanding I transfer ownership of the house to Tessa, along with continued mortgage payments for 18 months and a payment of $300,000 in damages. Attached to the claim was an email from my sister accusing me of stealing her opportunity. The paper smelled faintly of printer ink and betrayal. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, reading the same sentence over and over, trying to make the words line up with the people I thought I knew. The numbers blurred. My coffee had gone cold hours earlier, but I couldn't move. When I finally reached for my phone, my hands were trembling. Walter answered before the first ring finished. "They've gone too far this time," he said after I explained, his voice rough with quiet anger. "Don't you worry, kiddo. We'll figure this out." I spent the next few hours searching online for attorneys, scrolling past retainer fees that might as well have been written in another language. $10,000 just to start, sometimes more. I had drained most of my savings on the down payment and closing costs. Reality settled like a heavy coat around my shoulders. I'd have to face this myself, at least for now. That night, I didn't bother unpacking. The boxes waited in patient silence while I sat on the living room floor, surrounded by papers I barely understood, the faint ticking of the wall clock marking the slow hours. In place of panic came something quieter, something sturdier. A decision. I'd spent my entire adult life paying my own way, while my parents called every favor they could find to carry Tessa through one failed venture after another. They wanted to teach me a lesson for drawing a line. Fine, I'd learn how to defend it. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the half-drawn blinds, catching the edges of stacked envelopes spread across my dining table. I opened my laptop, began building folders, bank statements, pay stubs, tax returns, every record I'd kept since my first part-time job at 15. The numbers told their own story. I could see my life laid out in columns, wages earned, hours worked, years of careful saving. I remembered the smell of burnt espresso from that first coffee shop job, the way my feet ached after long shifts on linoleum floors. I remembered missing Tessa's lavish Sweet 16 because I couldn't afford to leave work early. That party had cost more than 3 months of my wages. The photographs from that night still float around the family group chat. Tessa, in her pink gown, a chocolate fountain glittering behind her. I was washing mugs, calculating how much of my paycheck could go toward a community college application fee. I pulled another file receipts from those years, textbooks bought, used tuition payments made on time. I could still hear my father's voice from that period. An accounting certificate, he'd said. That's not even a real degree. I learned to let the comment roll off to keep moving forward, but every line on that spreadsheet told the truth of what those years cost. The phone rang again. This time I let it go to voicemail. My mother's voice came through moments later, tight and rehearsed. "Sweetheart, we've always given you both what you needed. Why are you being so difficult about this?" I didn't reply. Another voicemail followed my father this time. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We can settle this quietly." I pressed delete without listening to the rest. I scrolled through my sister's social media out of a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Her feed looked like a travel magazine, cafes in Paris, rooftops in Rome, new art supplies stacked beside a smiling caption about following dreams. Meanwhile, I was still paying off student loans. I compared dates on her photos to my old bank statements and saw the overlap. The week I'd begged for help with an emergency dental bill, my parents had transferred $2,000 to her account for creative expenses. Another call came that afternoon. This one from Aunt Loretta. Her voice carried the same sharp tone I'd grown up bracing for. "You selfish girl," she hissed before I could speak. "After everything this family's done for you." I hung up without a word, then typed her name into a search bar. The foreclosure record from 5 years ago appeared almost immediately. The year she'd moved into my parents' guest house. It didn't take much to piece together her motive. Later that evening, I pulled up a real estate site out of habit, just to see if any listings nearby had dropped in price. Instead, a headline caught my eye: "Local art studio closes amid unpaid rent." The date matched exactly 3 weeks before the lawsuit was filed. My sister's eviction notice had been public record all along. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, until the light faded out of the room. The doorbell startled me not long after. Walter stood on the porch, a cardboard box in his hands. "Thought you might need these," he said, stepping inside. He set the box on the kitchen table with a grunt. Inside were neat folders, labeled by year, decades of family financial records he'd kept out of habit. "They pulled the same stunt on your cousin Evan," he said, lowering himself into a chair. "When his auto shop started turning a profit, they tried to claim he owed them for family investments." My phone buzzed again while we were talking. A message from Evan himself. "Heard about what's happening. They tried it with me, too. Don't let them win." The solidarity steadied me. For the first time in days, I didn't feel entirely alone. The following afternoon, a soft knock came at the door. A woman stood there holding a potted fern. "Welcome to the neighborhood," she said with a gentle smile. "I'm Marcia, 2 doors down." Her warmth cut through the tension that had settled in my chest. "Thank you," I said, taking the plant from her hands. She nodded toward the boxes still stacked behind me. "Looks like you've got a lot to unpack. Holler if you need anything." That night, sitting on the porch swing I'd installed myself, I watched the streetlights flicker on, one by one. Children's laughter drifted from a few houses down, and for a moment the noise of everything else fell away. I remembered walking this street as a teenager, promising myself I'd earn a home here someday. I had done it. I just hadn't expected to defend it from my own family. A text came through from my father just before I went inside. "We're giving you a chance to do the right thing before this gets uglier." I locked my phone, turned off the porch light, and let the darkness close around me. The house creaked softly as it settled the way new houses sometimes do, reminding me that foundations shift until they find balance. Tomorrow, I would start putting my defense together in earnest. Tonight, all I could do was breathe and hold on to the promise I'd made myself years ago that the life I built would belong to me and me alone. By the third morning, the dining room table was buried under stacks of files and folders. Every financial record I'd kept over the last 15 years had found its way there. Pay stubs, bank statements, loan summaries, and tax returns. The sunlight coming through the blinds left thin stripes across the papers, highlighting the careful columns I'd once been proud of. I spent hours cross-checking old deposits and writing notes in the margins until my wrist cramped. Each line showed a story that my family refused to see a trail of quiet effort that had built the foundation they were now trying to take. The work should have felt tedious, but it didn't. There was comfort in the order of it, the certainty of numbers that didn't lie. I sorted every record into folders labeled by year, building a case no one had asked for, but that I would need. Around noon, my phone lit up again. This time it was an email from my father, short and polished. "We're disappointed you're forcing this situation to escalate," it read. "There's still time to make things right." I stared at the message for a full minute before closing my laptop. I decided to take a break to step outside and breathe. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of cut grass and distant rain. Across the street, Marcia Dwyer was kneeling by her mailbox, trimming rose bushes with slow, practiced snips. She looked up and waved. I waved back. Then sat on the porch steps, watching a squirrel dart along the fence line. For a few quiet moments, the world felt normal again, but the phone buzzed once more. This time it was my aunt. Loretta Kane glowed across the screen, and I knew answering would be a mistake, but I did anyway. "You've embarrassed this family," she said without greeting. "Your mother is beside herself. We took you in, clothed you, and this is how you repay it. You're making us all look heartless." Her voice was sharp, brittle with resentment. I told her I wasn't discussing legal matters over the phone, and ended the call. My hands shook afterward, not from fear, but from something closer to exhaustion. By the afternoon, another certified letter had arrived. It outlined potential liens against my property if I failed to comply within 10 days. I read it twice, each time feeling the same dull ache rise in my chest. Then out of habit, I checked my sister's social media again. A new post had gone up, a close-up photo of her tearful face captioned, "Families should support each other no matter what." The comments were full of sympathy from strangers. Some called her brave. Others condemned the unnamed selfish sibling who had turned her back on family. The next day brought more of the same. Calls from unknown numbers, voicemails about doing the right thing, even an email from one of my parents' church friends asking if I needed guidance to mend my heart. It was like they'd all been handed the same script. I began keeping a log time date sender, anything that might one day matter in court. One evening while I was making tea, Walter showed up again. He had a new box under his arm, heavier this time. "Found more," he said, simply setting it beside the first one on the table. He poured himself a cup from my kettle, then sat quietly while I worked through the stack. Inside were decades of canceled checks, mortgage ledgers, and old loan applications my parents had filed. "They pulled the same thing with Evan, remember," he said after a while. "Tried to guilt him into signing over part of his business because they said they'd helped him buy the first equipment. He nearly lost everything." I nodded, tracing the dates on one of the documents. The pattern was the same: dependency disguised as generosity, and guilt used as leverage when independence appeared. Walter leaned back in his chair. "You did this on your own, Clara," he said gently. "They can't rewrite that no matter what kind of paper they send you." I didn't answer right away, but the words stayed with me long after he left. Later that week, I returned from work to find a small envelope tucked under my doormat. Inside was a folded note written in my mother's familiar cursive. "You've turned everyone against us," it read. "Think carefully before you destroy your own family." A chill ran through me. It wasn't the threat itself that hurt. It was the certainty behind it. The following morning, I went to the courthouse to file a response. The clerk, a woman with tired eyes and kind manners, flipped through my paperwork with visible surprise. "You're representing yourself?" she asked. I nodded. "Well," she said, stamping the first page, "you're more organized than half the lawyers who come through here. Good luck to you." I thanked her, and as I walked out the courthouse steps, felt heavier underfoot than I'd imagined. At work, Noah Grant called me into his office. "You've been distracted lately," he said, concerned, softening his tone. "If you need personal time, we can arrange that." I hesitated before explaining briefly that I was dealing with a family legal issue. His eyebrows rose slightly. "I see," he said. "Take what you need. Just make sure it doesn't consume you." I promised it wouldn't, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it myself. That weekend, I noticed a car circling my block, a silver sedan familiar in shape. When it passed a second time, I recognized the driver, Loretta. She slowed as she reached my driveway. her phone angled just enough to suggest she was taking photos. I stepped outside onto the porch. She didn't stop, but I saw her lips curl into something that wasn't quite a smile. Marcia appeared from her yard as the car disappeared around the corner. "You all right, honey?" she called out. I nodded. "Need me to keep an eye out?" I hesitated, then said yes. She nodded once. "We'll take turns. Nobody gets to harass a neighbor here." By that evening, a quiet sort of watch had formed on the street curtains. Shifting lights timed a sense of protection that had nothing to do with blood ties. The next few days blurred together. I spent my lunch breaks reading through property laws and court procedures, my evenings gathering more evidence. Each night, I checked the security footage Walter had insisted I install just in case. The camera lights blinked steady and calm. One morning, an envelope with a church letterhead appeared in my mailbox. Inside were several folded sheets labeled prayer requests. My name was printed in one of them, asking for forgiveness for my hardened heart toward family. I folded the papers neatly and set them aside with the rest of the evidence pile. By the end of that week, I was running on little sleep. I'd begun to understand that this wasn't just about the house. It was about control, about rewriting the story of my life before I'd even had the chance to live it fully. The only thing keeping me steady was the faint sense that someone somewhere believed in what I was doing. That reassurance came late on a Thursday. As I was cleaning up the table, a message from Evan appeared. "Got your back, cousin. They tried it with me, too. Send me anything you need." It was short, but it landed with the weight of something solid. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. That night, I sat on the porch swing again, the air cool against my skin, the street quiet except for crickets. A soft light glowed in Marcia's window. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and settled. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without bracing for the next blow. But I knew it wasn't over. The hearing date was approaching, and whatever peace I found now would have to carry me through what came next. The papers on my table were ready. The truth was ready, and so was I. The weekend before the hearing, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by folders, each one labeled and color-coded. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. I'd gone through every record twice, cross-checking each line against the statements Walter had brought. Somewhere in those numbers, I'd started to see a pattern that told more than a financial story. It showed how the strings had always been pulled. Every deposit, every transfer, every canceled check fit together like a puzzle I'd been too busy to notice before. Late in the evening, my grandfather stopped by again, carrying another worn box from his garage. "Thought this might help," he said, setting it down on the floor. Inside were old manila folders labeled with dates from decades past, house repairs, tuition receipts, investment notes. He eased himself into a chair, rubbing his hands together, as if the act of remembering had left them cold. "You know," he said after a while, "your parents tried this with Thomas 2 years ago. When his business started turning a profit, they said he owed them for family investments. Same kind of talk you're hearing now." I nodded slowly, the truth of it fitting too easily into place. When Walter left, I stayed up late studying the newest stack of papers. That's when I found it, an email chain buried between scanned bank records. The subject line read, "Family Matters." The message was from my aunt, written to my mother, weeks before the lawsuit began. Time to teach Clara a lesson before she gets too independent. My stomach tightened as I read it again. I printed the page and slipped it into a binder marked Exhibits. The house was silent, except for the hum of the printer and the faint creak of settling wood. The next day, I opened a drawer and found the photo album Walter had given me earlier that month. The edges were worn, the plastic sleeves slightly yellowed with age. Inside were snapshots of moments I hadn't thought about in years. Me behind the counter of a small diner, a paper hat on my head, another of me standing outside the community college library, holding a stack of textbooks, a third showing my grandmother at my graduation, her smile proud and steady. And Walter's handwriting was in the corner of that photo. "She believed in you." I traced the letters with my thumb before closing the album. By evening, I stood in front of the mirror, rehearsing the words I'd written. I kept my voice level, my shoulders straight. "I am not responsible for supporting adults who refuse to support themselves," I said quietly, repeating the sentence until it no longer trembled. I chose the blazer I'd bought last year on clearance, pressed it carefully, and laid it across a chair. It was time to start seeing myself the way the judge would, a professional, prepared woman who had worked for everything she had. The following morning, I spent hours assembling binders, each labeled with a tab: Employment Records, Loan Statements, Financial Transfers, Exhibit AG. My kitchen looked less like a home and more like a law office. The faint smell of coffee mixed with the scent of printer ink. When I looked up, the sun had climbed past noon. I paused to stretch and noticed Walter's truck pull into the driveway. He stepped out carrying a small framed photo one of my grandmother from years ago, her hands dusted with flour from baking. "Take this with you," he said, setting it gently beside my files. "She'd want you to remember who you come from." That night, I couldn't sleep. The house seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the security lights cast a pale glow across the lawn, catching the edges of the fence in silver. I checked each lock twice before returning to bed, lying awake until the early hours, counting the slow rhythm of the ceiling fan. When morning came, I made coffee and dressed carefully, the motions practiced and deliberate. Walter pulled into the driveway just as I was locking the front door. "You ready?" he asked, opening the passenger door of his truck. I nodded, clutching the briefcase that held the weight of 15 years' work. The courthouse was quiet, its glass doors gleaming under the early sun. The marble floors inside reflected the light in sharp, clean lines. I could feel my heart beating as I walked through security, the metal detector beeping softly before clearing me through. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, rows of wooden benches, a raised desk for the judge, and the faint smell of old paper. My parents were already there, sitting side by side in matching navy suits. Tessa sat behind them, her eyes rimmed in pink, but carefully made up. Aunt Loretta hovered nearby, a folder in hand. My father's attorney adjusted his tie as I took my seat at the defendant's table. He looked me over once, his expression practiced and calm. When the bailiff called for order, everyone stood. Judge Elena Alvarez entered, her gaze sweeping the room before she sat. "You may be seated," she said, her voice even and composed. My father's attorney began with a statement about family obligations and moral duty. He spoke about sacrifice, about how parents invest in their children's futures, and how those children should repay that debt once successful. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly on the table. When it was my turn, I rose and placed my binder on the podium. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, "this case isn't about family obligation. It's about ownership and personal responsibility. I worked from the time I was 15, paying for every expense out of my own earnings. The down payment on my home came from 15 years of saving." I paused to open one of the binders, sliding a set of statements across the table to the clerk. "These are my financial records showing every deposit and payment made." My parents' support went entirely to my sister, not to me. The judge examined the documents, her pen tapping once against her notepad. "Continue," she said. I presented the next set of exhibits: emails, receipts, proof of the transfers my parents had made to cover Tessa's student loans and business expenses. Each record was highlighted, each note explained. I kept my tone measured, letting the numbers speak for themselves. When my mother took the stand, she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "We sacrificed everything for our girls," she said. "Private lessons, summer camps. How can she turn her back on us now?" Her voice cracked, drawing a sympathetic murmur from the bench behind her. I didn't look away, but I didn't engage either. Then my father testified. "In our family, successful children help their parents," he said firmly. "That's understood." Judge Alvarez leaned forward slightly. "And when was this agreement made?" she asked. "It's traditional," my father replied after a pause, implied. When it was my turn to cross-examine, I spoke quietly. "Did you pay off Tessa's student loans?" He hesitated. "Yes," he said finally. "And provide additional funds for her business. She needed help pursuing her art," he said. "So the expectation of repayment applies to me, but not to her." He shifted in his chair. "She's different." The room fell silent for a moment. Then the judge spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Whitman." I returned to my seat, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. The rest of the proceedings blurred together. When it was over, Judge Alvarez closed her folder and looked between both sides. "I've heard enough," she said. "This case lacks legal merit. Property purchased independently remains independent. Case dismissed with prejudice." A sound escaped my mother, half gasp, half cry. My father's jaw tightened. Aunt Loretta's lips thinned as she whispered something to my sister, who stared at me with wet eyes and disbelief. The bailiff called for order again as the judge left the room. Outside, sunlight filled the courthouse steps. Walter stood waiting near the truck, his hands in his pockets. When he saw me, he nodded once, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You did good," he said. I exhaled, realizing only then that I'd been holding my breath. We drove home in near silence, the hum of the engine filling the space where words might have gone. I watched the courthouse shrink in the rearview mirror, its sharp edges softening against the light. Somewhere inside, I could still hear my mother's voice echoing after me, asking how I could do this to my family. At a stoplight, Walter looked over. "Your grandmother would have been proud," he said. I stared out the window, the trees blurring past. The day felt heavier than victory, but lighter than fear. The line between what was mine and what they wanted had finally been drawn. That night, the house felt different still, but solid. I set the framed photo of my grandmother on the kitchen counter beside the files. The quiet wasn't peace yet, but it was close. I knew the fight wasn't finished. Some things don't end with a judge's words. They shift, they adapt. But for the first time in months, I allowed myself to breathe. Tomorrow would bring whatever came next. Tonight, I would let the silence hold. 3 days after the court dismissed the case, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing across the kitchen counter. At first, I thought it was work, another round of emails about a project deadline, but when I glanced at the screen, it was my sister's name. The message preview showed a link. Out of habit, I tapped it before I could think twice. The page opened to a fundraising site. Tessa's face filled the screen, her eyes red, her expression solemn. The headline read, "My sister stole my future, help me start over." Below it was a long paragraph about betrayal, family, and lost dreams. Every word twisted the story I had just spent months proving false. She described me as a heartless sibling who took advantage of our parents and left her homeless and without hope. The goal at the top showed $20,000. My stomach dropped. I took a screenshot and sent it to my attorney contact, then silenced my phone. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator. The quiet felt heavier than it had before. When I turned back to the counter, Walter's photo of Grandma caught the light. Her expression in that old picture looked steady, almost knowing, as if she'd seen storms like this before. By noon, the post had spread. My email filled with messages, some supportive, others sharp. A few distant relatives forwarded the link with subject lines like, "What happened, and please explain your side." That afternoon, Evan texted, "You might want to check your inbox. There's a family-wide email going around." I opened it and stared at my father's name in the sender line. The message was long written in the same calm, rehearsed tone he used in business memos. He described my public disrespect and warned the family to reserve judgment until she finds her way back to the values she was raised with. Attached was the fundraiser link. I read the email twice, then closed the laptop. Outside, the neighborhood was quiet, though I noticed a familiar silver car creeping slowly down the street. Loretta's sedan moved at a crawl, her window lowered just enough for her phone to peek out. She drove past twice before turning the corner. I stepped inside, locked the door, and checked the security feed. The camera caught her clearly this time. That evening, as I was washing dishes, motion alerts pinged again. I opened the app and saw her car parked near the curb. The next moment, the porch light camera showed her walking up my driveway with something in her hand. The image froze just as the can of red spray paint flashed in the light. She leaned toward the door, made one quick swipe, then looked up straight into the lens. The footage caught her face as she realized she was being recorded. She dropped the can into her purse and hurried away, leaving a thick red streak across the wood. When the police arrived, the officer watched the footage twice before nodding. "That's clear enough," he said, jotting notes on a clipboard. "You want to press charges?" I hesitated, thinking of every family dinner, every awkward holiday. "I need to file a restraining order," I said quietly. He nodded once, almost like he'd expected that answer. The next morning I stood in the courthouse again, this time at the filing window. The clerk recognized my last name immediately. "Judge Alvarez's courtroom," she asked, flipping through forms. "Yes," I said. "Same family, different matter." She didn't comment, just handed me the papers. That afternoon I met with the officer who'd taken the report. He filed an affidavit describing the vandalism and harassment. The temporary order was granted that day. When I stepped outside, the sky was the same clear blue it had been the morning of the trial, but the air felt different, heavier, like a line had been crossed that couldn't be undone. In the days that followed, the noise from my family quieted. The fundraiser vanished from the site flagged for fraud. The smear emails slowed. A few relatives reached out in private, their messages short and careful. "Proud of you," one cousin wrote. "Wish I'd stood up when they did this to me." One afternoon, Marcia knocked on my door holding a basket of bread. "Saw the article," she said. "Takes guts to stand up to people like that." Her voice was calm, not prying. She set the basket down on the counter and glanced toward the freshly repainted door. "Color looks good," she added. I smiled faintly. "It's stronger now than before." That weekend, Walter came by with lunch. We sat in the backyard, the late summer air warm against our shoulders. He set down 2 plates and a stack of old documents. "You know," he said, adjusting his hat, "your grandmother saw this kind of thing coming. That's why she handled things the way she did." I looked up, puzzled. He nodded toward the papers. "That money you used for your down payment? That was hers. She left it for you in her will, separate from your parents. She told me once she wanted you to have something no one could take away." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The truth fit neatly into every missing space. "They knew," I said quietly. Walter nodded. "They did. They just didn't like what it meant." That night I went through the will papers again. There it was, in plain text, her signature, the designation, the clause that kept the funds separate. The realization brought both comfort and a kind of ache I hadn't expected. She'd trusted me to build something real, and I'd done exactly that. When the permanent hearing for the restraining order came, my parents arrived without the matching shirts they'd worn to the first case. Their new lawyer spoke of reconciliation and misunderstanding. He painted me as defensive, even paranoid. When my turn came, I placed the security footage and police report before the judge. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," I said evenly. "It was deliberate." Judge Alvarez watched the video in silence. When it ended, she set her pen down. "Enough," she said. "This behavior stops now. The restraining order is granted and will include digital harassment. Any violation will result in immediate action." Outside the courthouse steps felt steadier under my feet this time. Walter waited at the curb again, the same steady presence as before. As we drove away, he said, "You know, your grandmother used to say, some people only understand boundaries when they run straight into them." I let out a quiet breath, watching the buildings slide past. That evening, the local paper ran a short story, "Family Property Dispute Ends with Restraining Order." I didn't read the comments, but the headline was enough. Messages trickled in, neighbors, co-workers, even old classmates. "Proud of you," one read. "It takes courage to stand up to your own." Later, as the sky darkened, I stood in the doorway of my home. The new paint on the door gleamed faintly under the porch light. Inside, everything was quiet files neatly stacked, the air smelling faintly of cedar from the repairs. It wasn't perfect peace, not yet, but it was honest. Through the window, I could see Walter's truck parked by the curb, his silhouette visible in the driver's seat. He waited until I waved before pulling away. I locked the door and turned off the lights one by one. Upstairs, I set my phone on the nightstand. The notifications had slowed to almost nothing. My home felt steady again, the silence no longer heavy but whole. Tomorrow I'd start reclaiming the parts of my life I'd put on hold. For now, though, I let the quiet settle, certain of only one thing, that the people who build their own foundations learn how to keep them standing, no matter who tries to shake them. The weeks after the restraining order were quiet, at least from the outside. I went back to work, caught up on projects, and tried to find my rhythm again. But quiet doesn't always mean peaceful. Some nights I'd wake to the soft chime of the security system, only to see the empty street glowing under the porch light. Other nights I'd sit on the couch with the television playing low, scrolling through my messages. Most of them were kind neighbors checking in cousins, sending short notes of encouragement, but there were others that carried a familiar weight. Family means forgiveness, one read. Another asked if I'd done enough damage. I deleted them one by one. One Thursday morning, I opened my front door and found a single white envelope resting on the mat. No return address. Inside was a page printed from an online article, an opinion piece about modern selfishness and how adult children forget their parents once they succeed. A faint smear of red lipstick marked the fold. I didn't need a signature to know where it came from. I slipped it into a file with the others, labeling it and tucking it away with quiet precision. Walter stopped by later that afternoon. "You holding up?" he asked, setting a brown paper bag on the counter. The smell of stew filled the kitchen as he unpacked it. I nodded. "Trying to," I said. He looked around the room, his eyes pausing on the newly painted door. "They still circling?" I shook my head. "Not lately." He poured coffee for us both. "Good. That means the boundaries are doing their job." We ate in near silence, the clink of spoons against ceramic marking the passing minutes. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair. "You know your grandmother never talked about her own parents much," he said. "They didn't like the man she married, said he wasn't ambitious enough. She used to tell me that sometimes the hardest part of growing up is realizing you can't make everyone proud at once." He smiled faintly. "She'd be proud of you, though. No doubt about that." That evening, I checked the local paper online. The short article about the restraining order had drawn quiet attention, just enough for people to notice without feeding gossip. The comments were turned off a small mercy. My inbox stayed mercifully still for a few days. But then the emails started again, this time from distant relatives I barely remembered. They all said the same thing in different words. "We love you, but family matters should stay private." I replied to none of them. The following weekend, Mrs. Chen, one of my older neighbors, invited me over for tea. She had a gentle way of speaking each word deliberate. "I saw your name in the paper," she said, handing me a delicate porcelain cup. "You did the right thing. I know your kind of family. My husband's brother tried to do the same to us once many years ago. Always asking, never giving." Her small smile carried both understanding and strength. We talked until the tea turned cold, and when I left, she pressed a small packet of dried lavender into my hand. "For calm," she said simply. By the time autumn arrived, the air carried that crisp stillness that makes everything sound sharper. I spent weekends repairing small things around the house, tightening cabinet handles, painting trim, sanding down the edge of the porch railing. The simple work steadied me. But just as life began to settle, a message from Evan appeared on my phone. "Need to talk. Call me when you can." When I called, his voice was low and tense. "They've started reaching out again," he said. "Your father sent a letter to Aunt Margie, said you've been spreading lies about the family, trying to ruin their reputation." He paused. "They're trying to spin this their way. Just a heads up." I thanked him, though a part of me already knew it wouldn't stop there. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this one typed formal and full of veiled accusations about emotional distress and unfair character portrayals. It came from my parents' new attorney. I scanned it, marked the key phrases, and sent copies to my file. There was no real threat inside, just noise dressed as authority. Still, it left a familiar heaviness in my chest. That night, as I was locking up, the motion sensor near the gate flickered. I checked the camera feed, nothing but shadows shifting across the grass. I left the light on anyway. The following week, Walter and I spent an afternoon in his garage sorting through old tools. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and oil. He worked quietly, handing me wrenches to organize by size. "You know," he said, "there's a kind of peace that only comes after a fight's truly finished. Until then, all you can do is keep your guard up, but keep living too." He looked up at me, then eyes steady. "Don't let them freeze you in place." The next morning, a text from Noah popped up just as I was pouring coffee. "You've got people in your corner here. Don't forget that." Attached was a link to an article about workplace harassment laws. For a second I thought he'd sent it by mistake, then I saw the subheading. "When personal attacks follow you to work." A quiet reminder that even if the outside world didn't see it, the ripples were still moving. By mid-November, the neighborhood had become a small net of protection. Marcia waved each time I drove by her porch light, always on in the evenings. Mrs. Chen left fresh herbs from her garden on my doorstep every few days. Even the kids down the block started waving as they passed with their bikes, the kind of small gestures that mean more than words. Still, the tension hadn't fully left. Some nights I'd find myself replaying everything, the first letter, the courtroom, the paint on the door. But each time I'd remind myself that the worst of it was behind me. The rest was just noise fading into distance. One afternoon while cleaning the attic, I found a small wooden box I didn't recognize. Inside were photographs I'd never seen before, pictures of my grandmother standing beside a younger version of my mother, both smiling in front of an old farmhouse. On the back of one, written in neat cursive, were the words, "For the one who keeps going, even when no one sees." I sat there for a long time, the dust motes drifting through the sunlight, and felt something settle quietly inside me. Later that week, I decided to invite a few people over, just a small dinner, to thank the ones who had helped me through the storm. Walter brought a loaf of fresh bread, Marcia came with a casserole, and Mrs. Chen arrived with her favorite tea. The house filled with the smell of food and the sound of laughter. It felt different this time, lighter-rooted. When everyone left, I stood in the doorway watching the taillights fade down the street. The night air was cool and clean. The security camera blinked softly above the porch, its light steady and calm. Inside, I placed the photograph of my grandmother on the mantel, next to a candle that flickered faintly in the draft. Her smile in that picture seemed almost alive in the glow. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was defending something fragile. I felt like I was building something lasting. Tomorrow, I'd call the contractor about starting a small renovation, a new dining table, maybe a garden shed out back, something to mark this next chapter. Because even though the echoes of the past still lingered, the house had finally started to feel like what it was meant to be, a place that belonged fully to me. Winter came early that year. The trees along my street lost their leaves overnight, and frost etched soft patterns across the windows each morning. The house felt quieter, but somehow fuller, now grounded in its own stillness. I'd settled into a rhythm again, work during the week, small repairs on weekends, coffee with Walter on Sundays. The worst of the chaos had faded, replaced by something steadier. But peace doesn't always mean everything stops. The past has its own way of knocking, even when you think the door is locked. One afternoon, as I was wrapping up a report at work, Noah stopped by my desk. "You've got a visitor in the lobby," he said quietly. I looked up surprised. She wouldn't give her name. My pulse quickened, but I followed him out. In the lobby, Tessa sat on the edge of a chair wrapped in a wool coat that hung too loosely around her. She looked smaller than I remembered. When she saw me, she stood, her expression a mix of defiance and exhaustion. "Clara," she said, her voice rough. "Can we talk?" We stepped outside into the chill air. Cars moved steadily down the street, their tires whispering against the wet pavement. "I just need a minute," she said. "I'm not here to fight." She dug into her bag and pulled out a folded envelope. "Mom and Dad are not doing well. They think I can fix this if I talk to you." I didn't take it. "There's nothing left to fix," I said. "The court settled everything." She nodded slowly, tucking the envelope back into her coat. "Yeah, I know. I guess I just thought you'd want to know that Dad's blood pressure's been bad, and Mom can't sleep." The silence between us stretched thin. I could hear the faint hiss of wind through bare branches. "Tessa," I said finally, "I'm sorry they're struggling, but I can't be the solution to that anymore." Her eyes welled and she gave a small nod before turning away. She paused once halfway across the parking lot. "They said you'd turned cold," she called over her shoulder, "but I think maybe you're just tired." Then she was gone. I stood there for a long time before going back inside. Noah looked up as I passed. "Everything okay?" he asked. "It will be," I said. That night I found the strength to open the envelope she'd left behind on the office bench. Inside was a letter in my mother's handwriting. The words were careful, deliberate apologies buried beneath conditions. She wrote about misunderstandings, about wanting to heal as a family, and about how forgiveness restores what's broken. Near the bottom, she added, "Your father misses you but doesn't know how to reach out." I folded the paper neatly and placed it in the same drawer where I'd stored the first legal notice months ago. They belonged to different worlds now. days passed quietly after that. Work picked up, the holidays approached, and the rhythm of life returned in slow, cautious steps. But one evening, just as I was settling in with a book, the security app pinged, a new alert motion detected near the porch. When I opened the feed, a familiar silhouette stood by the mailbox. Walter. He held something small in his hands, wrapped in brown paper. I opened the door before he could knock. "You didn't have to drive out this late," I said. "It's freezing." He smiled faintly. "Couldn't sleep," he said. "Brought you something." Inside the package was an old pocket watch, the brass worn smooth from years of use. "It was your grandmother's father's," he said. "She wanted you to have it eventually. Figured now was the right time." The second hand ticked softly, steady, and sure. We sat for a while at the kitchen table, talking about small things, the weather, the holidays, the new neighbors who'd moved in down the block. After a pause, Walter said quietly, "I ran into your father yesterday, at the hardware store." I looked up. "How was he?" Walter sighed. "Older. Quieter. He said they're selling the lake house. Can't keep up with it anymore." I didn't respond right away. The lake house had been our family's crown jewel, the place my parents used to show off at gatherings. "He mentioned you," Walter added. "Said he wonders if you'd ever visit." I met his eyes. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said. "Not yet." He nodded like he'd expected that answer. The next morning, I drove out to the edge of town, where the lake house sat more out of curiosity than intention. The property was quiet, the yard unkempt. A for sale sign leaned slightly in the frozen ground. Through the window, I could see the living room where so many family arguments had played out. The polished furniture, the framed photographs still hanging neatly in place. I didn't get out of the car. Some things I realized are best left behind exactly as they are. A few days later, I received an email from Evan. "The story's making its rounds again," he wrote. "But this time people are starting to see it for what it is. You're not the only one who got targeted. Others are speaking up." Attached were screenshots, messages from cousins and family friends who'd quietly distanced themselves from my parents, finally acknowledging the manipulation that had been whispered about for years. I stared at the screen until the words blurred, not from sadness this time, but from relief. That evening I made tea and sat on the porch. The sky was a deep indigo stars, sharp against the cold. Marcia passed by on her evening walk, waving from the sidewalk. "How's the house holding up?" she called. "Stronger than ever," I said. She laughed softly. "That's what I like to hear." When she disappeared down the block, I turned back toward the window. Inside, the clock on the mantel ticked in rhythm with the pocket watch Walter had given me. The sound was small but grounding. For the first time, it didn't remind me of what I'd lost. It reminded me of what had endured. Later that night, as I wrote in my journal, I noticed the reflection of the porch light on the glass, the faint red paint from months ago still visible beneath the new coat. It had faded, but not completely, a reminder of where the boundary had been drawn and why it mattered. Before going to bed, I sent Walter a message. "Thank you for the watch. It's keeping perfect time." He replied a few minutes later. "Good, that's what it's meant to do. Some things just need steady hands to keep them running." I smiled, setting the phone aside. The house creaked softly as the wind shifted outside. Tomorrow I'd meet Evan and a few relatives for dinner, people who'd chosen truth over silence, the kind of family you build rather than inherit. And though I didn't know what the next chapter would look like, I knew it would be written on my own terms in the home I had fought to protect. The night before the dinner, I set the table with quiet care. The dining room, once echoing with emptiness, now felt alive, framed photos on the walls. Fresh flowers from Mrs. Chen's garden in a vase at the center. The pocket watch Walter had given me rested nearby, its steady ticking marking time with a comforting rhythm. Maple, my golden mix, slept near the doorway, her soft snoring adding warmth to the house's quiet heartbeat. When the doorbell rang, the sound didn't carry tension anymore, it felt like a welcome. Evan arrived first, arms full of grocery bags. Behind him came Rachel and her children, laughing as they handed me a homemade pie still warm from the oven. Walter brought a bottle of cider, and Marcia carried her usual casserole dish wrapped in a faded checkered towel. Soon the house hummed with conversation, with stories that filled the spaces that used to hold worry. Dinner stretched into the evening. We talked about work, about the neighbors, about small things that seemed ordinary but felt extraordinary in their simplicity. At one point, Walter stood and tapped his glass with a fork. To new beginnings, he set his voice steady but soft, and to the strength it takes to build a home, not just a house. Everyone raised their glasses. I met his eyes across the table, the same steady gray that had anchored me through everything, and smiled. After dessert, the children chased Maple in the yard while the adults stayed inside. Rachel, clearing dishes, looked around and said, "You've made this place your own, Clara. It feels safe here." I glanced at the door, remembering what it had once symbolized. "It took a while," I said quietly, "but it finally does." When everyone left, the silence that followed wasn't heavy, it was peaceful. The house felt full even when it was empty. I walked from room to room, turning off lights, lingering a moment in each space. The study, where I'd once sorted through evidence and sleepless worry, now held shelves lined with books and a framed photo of Grandma and me. The living room, where the court papers had once covered the floor, now glowed under soft lamplight. Every corner carried the mark of rebuilding proof that healing didn't erase scars, it just made them part of the story. A week later, I drove out to the hardware store, where Walter liked to spend his mornings. He waved when I walked in, a coffee in one hand, catalog in the other. "Thought I'd find you here," I said, grinning. "You always do," he replied. We talked about small projects then, about life in general. Before I left, he said, "You know, your grandmother used to say, strength isn't about fighting, it's about holding your peace when no one else can give it to you." That night, I sat on the porch swing as the sun went down, the horizon painted in soft oranges and pinks. The neighborhood had grown familiar, the steady rhythm of cars passing, children's laughter from the next yard, the smell of wood smoke drifting through the air. I thought of my parents then, not with anger, but with acceptance. Some distances aren't meant to be crossed right away, and some wounds take silence, not words, to close. The security system chimed softly as I locked up for the night. I paused by the door, tracing the faint outline of where the red paint had once been. The mark was gone, but the lesson it carried remained. Boundaries weren't walls. They were gates that opened only when trust was earned. Upstairs, Maple curled beside the bed as I turned out the light. The house settled into quiet again, the kind that comes not from absence, but from peace. Looking back, I realized I'd fought not just for a home, but for something deeper, for the right to live without apology, to protect what I'd built, to choose family by character rather than bloodline. Justice, I learned, isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the steady hum of a life reclaimed, the calm after years of noise. As I drifted towards sleep, I thought about the people who had stayed, the ones who believed in standing firm but living kindly. The kind of family that doesn't take what's yours, but helps you guard it. And if anyone listening has ever had to fight quietly for their own peace, I hope you know this. The battle ends the moment you stop defending your worth and start living in it. Thank you for listening to my story. If it made you think of your own journey, share it below. I'd love to hear how you found your way back to yourself.